right, now we're turning towards Donetsk. On September 4th, Andrei Purgin, Speaker of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic's legislature, was arrested along with his wife and accused of staging a coup. Since then, he's been replaced by Denis Pushylin, the former deputy speaker. And so all these workings, when it comes to the leadership of Donetsk, remain murky, but they give some indication of what's going on.
So we have here brilliant journalists Simon Ostrovsky from the Vice News and Oliver Carroll from The Independent, who've both had interviewed those guys in Donetsk.
And we're very appreciative to have Oliver here, one in the beginning and again now.
But you were following the whole change. What do you know, what it could mean, and what do you, I don't know, sources tell you?
Well, in my view, from reading sort of the tea leaves of what's been going on over there, to be honest, this could mean that we're moving closer to an end to the war. I think it's actually very good news because I see Purgin, you know, one of the ideologues, one of the founders of the Donetsk Republic and then the Donetsk People's Republic later on, as being very true to the cause of expanding, you know, the Russian world and expanding the Russian Empire, in his view, and continuing the war. And I think a big reason for his removal is the fact that he wouldn't have agreed to a peace agreement under the Minsk agreements that are currently being negotiated. And his replacement with Pushylin, who's not ideological at all, much more of a pragmatist, much more of a sort of manager, who doesn't really have any big ideas, but sort of managed to weasel his way into the hierarchical structure of the Donetsk People's Republic, means that also he's the Minsk negotiator for the Donetsk People's Republic, don't forget. So he's, you know, vested in the peace process, to me says that they are trying to now come to some kind of an accommodation. And this reshuffle in the Donetsk People's Republic mirrors what's happening here in Kiev in the parliament with the constitutional amendments. And I think those two things are very much tied together. So, you know, these, the passage of the special status amendments in the first reading a couple of days ago when that protest happened where 3 people were killed, is you know, the first step from the Ukrainian side towards going towards a peace deal. And removing Purgin, in my view, is the first step for the pro-Russian side in compromise and moving towards a peace deal as well. And the question now really is, what kind of special status is the Donbass going to get? What's it going to look like? How much autonomy is it going to have? Is it going to look like South Ossetia, or is it going to look like Transnistria?
We've just discussed that with the Ukrainian lawyers who are specialists in that, and that is way far from that, because all these constitutional amendments, they are more or less about different types of self-governors, and that is not that clear, so that should be discussed. But I'll remind you about another man, you know, Alexander Zakharchenko, who is so-called leader of self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic. So can you also explain, with all these things, so we have Zakharchenko, and now there is this shuffle, this change, what it all mean? I mean, for the Zakharchenko and in general, are these guys so important that their change matters?
Well, I mean, I broadly concur with what Simon is saying. I think at the same time there have been a lot of theories about this being a sort of a local match between the Moscow curators, the Surkov, the presidential aide in Moscow, and Volodin. I think that seems to be a little bit false. I think that's unlikely to be what's actually happened. And broadly speaking, we know that Purgin was in Russia, was supposed to be drumming up support for a referendum to join Russia. So that's probably, that sounds logical. At the same time, it seems to me that this is less saying that this is the end of the war, as more saying that Moscow has greater control over the players in Donetsk, so it can turn the temperature up and turn the temperature down as it sees fit.
So what does Moscow want now? I mean, if they seem to be exerting greater control over Donetsk, what are the indications for what Moscow wants?
I think Moscow is trying to turn the temperature down right now.
At the moment, yeah.
Absolutely. And for them, they're trying to reestablish their relationship with the rest of the world, play the good guy a little bit more. You have to look at what's happened. This Purgin switch-up is directly related to the wider context of the whole world, and Russia sending troops over the last few days to Syria and turning up the heat there and turning down the heat here.
Putin is going to the General Assembly in the UN and all its...
On the 15th of September, Putin is probably going to make some kind of an announcement or speech at the United Nations. We don't know what he's going to say, but I think it's going to be very important. And I think the other thing that's going to be very important to watch is the Minsk negotiations over the next couple of days next week, because Pushylin, now in his elevated status as Speaker of the so-called Council of the Donetsk People's Republic, is going there with renewed authority. He's now not just some deputy speaker. He's the Speaker of their Parliament Assembly, and he's going to be negotiating on their behalf, so he's going to have a lot more political capital.
Just shortly...
Just very briefly, I also think there's a local element, and I think that we all need to think about last year, just before the elections last year. There were elections due in DNR, with the story with Gubarev, who was shot at when he was travelling to Rostov. And the other thing to point out is that just in the last month and 2 months, things have got very tense and sketchy in Donetsk itself, starting with the attacks on the OSCE, but more recently, a lot of journalists have been kicked out of Donetsk as well. So there's a tension, there's a paranoia, and I think this is also part of the story.
But how would you also describe for the people who haven't followed so precisely the situation in these occupied territories? What we know, the recent days were incredibly calm. I mean, but it's very special days. It's exactly a year since the Minsk agreement had been signed, so maybe it's something for show off. But in general, from your latest what is your latest impression on the situation in that territory, in the conflict zone?
I haven't been there for months, so I don't know what it feels like to be there right now, and I can't really speak on that. But I think it's important to remember that everything that goes down in the Donbass really depends on Moscow and what Moscow wants, and ultimately what Putin wants. And I think Putin wants to show the world that he's strong, but he also doesn't want continued sanctions, and he doesn't want a weakening Russian economy. So I think in his head he's made a trade. He said, I'll show my people and the rest of the world that I can kick ass in Syria and deal with ISIS much better than the United States can, and that'll earn me lots of kudos and brownie points, and see how strong a leader I am, and at the same time I can patch things up in Ukraine and find a solution that looks good both to my people and to the Western powers, and maybe the sanctions will either not be increased or some of them will be withdrawn, and the economy won't be suffering so much, and that's going to be a big win for him as well.
And it's a good pivot because he's gotten a lot of praise for Syria in the past. I mean, I think there was talk about a peace prize at some point. These are issues where even in the West he was seen more positively than he is with Ukraine. But my question maybe to you, Oliver, is when we talk about how things are decided in Moscow and how what happens in Donetsk reflected is in Moscow, I mean, what are the importance of these positions? I mean, for a small council, from one person changing to another role, who has the power? Is it just the equivalent of Kremlinology when in the Soviet Union people would look at reshuffles and trying to guess what it means? What sort of an indication is that?
Well, I would add, things depend on Moscow, but there's a certain amount of the deliberate organised chaos going on. And certainly there's been a change in the last year. Say a year ago, Moscow was very much interested in building in these new government institutions. Now the presence in Donetsk is a lot less.
But they seem better organized. I mean, from this...
They seem better organized, but to a certain extent, until the last couple of months. In the last couple of months, there's been it's been very shaky there. A lot of the positions are ornamental, and I think that there's a big question about Alexander Zakharchenko, who was not actually present at the emergency meeting on Thursday evening. The next morning, he was also a fully signed up member of the Minsk agreements, which is a bit of a U-turn for him. So it seems to me that his position was under a certain amount of threat. But he's now signed up and he's now falling into line.
Okay, thanks, Oliver. Simon, there is a lot for you to do. There were recently published the photos, selfies of the Russian soldiers in Syria.
Oh,
so
yeah.
there is something you can follow up. But thanks a lot for joining us.